Okay, good morning, everybody. Very nice to see you all on this cold, wintry day. Yesterday it was very warm in Sapporo, I can tell you, in northern Japan, where I've just come from. But I'm very glad to be here. I think this is a really important thing that you're doing. I think the branching out beyond the classroom, or even actually being more ambitious about the scope of what's done within the classroom, is a really important question that teachers should always ask themselves. But teachers of EAL, I think, need to give a lot more attention than perhaps we do to the A part of the EAL, the additional additive, which immediately connects us to the social context, the wider world in which learners, be they adults or children, live. And that's a large part of what I'm going to be saying. So what I'm going to do this morning in my 3.5-hour paper that I've prepared is to talk about really what I do, the kind of business that I think I do, which is called language planning, there it does work. Language planning, which actually, as the name implies, involves intervention in some kind of way beyond just language to deal with society in very important consequences that learning or not learning well English in a society that penalises people for not knowing English well implies. We have to keep in mind that the consequences of not knowing English well in Australia are really substantial, and that's something that should influence our whole approach to this field. So what I'm going to do in this talk is make a distinction between, I think, a relative silence that teachers and EAL teachers in particular have in what I would call policy influencing in their role as citizens. And the reason I say that is you need to keep in mind the way I understand policy is a conjunction or a coming together of knowledge and power. The power to change things in the real world and the knowledge of what needs to be changed and how the change ought to happen. And I think it won't be, thank you very much, I don't think it'll be a difficult thing for you to accept that actually teachers' voices are practically absent. I mean, if you look at public debate in Australia, what are the topics that are so prominent? They are constantly about the integration of minority populations, about the settlement or non-settlement, mistreatment of refugee and asylum seeker populations, about the long-term integration and development of a pluralist society. And yet I don't think I've seen a letter in the newspaper in the last 3 years that has said, as a TESOL educator, or I can add to this discussion this level of knowledge that comes. I've seen some. There have been some in the conversation. There have been a few places here and there. But they're small echo chambers. Unfortunately, we are generally not listened to. Now, I'm not saying that that's our fault particularly, but I do think that there is a problem of this kind. And that's possibly because teachers do not actually have a strong theory of social change. They're mostly concerned about the practice that they're engaged in the classroom and the learners in front of them. This is, of course, proper and responsible. But when we're dealing with EAL, as I'm going to show both from several personal experiences but also from the wider context, we're dealing with something for which I've already said the consequences of not doing well are very serious. So I think that this involves teachers inevitably, or it should, as policy planners, meaning introducing the specialist knowledge that teachers have, the claim to authority that teaching gives you. After all, who knows what struggles immigrant or Indigenous people learning English have with settlement other than the people that are closest to them? And that particular perspective is hardly ever present. I think this is a really serious question. Now, I'm also then going to go on to talk about more specifically in the classroom what used to be called education linguistics, when Professor Bernard Spolsky kind of introduced this area in the late 1970s, but I think is now called other things. And I'm going to call it language planning, that is teaching as language planning, what teaching does that actually plans the language lives of learners. It's not just about English, it's about many more things with English at its centre, obviously. And the aim I have here is to support you in the way that, whatever way I can, to reflect on these aspects of leadership. I can't talk about all of the 4 themes that you have, but about leadership, which I think is really needed from your association and from you. Our communities are becoming increasingly diverse. We know this, it's a cliche, but teachers and teacher associations really need to be more assertive, in my opinion, because they have a unique perspective on the problems that we're debating in the media. And these aspects, the social, personal and educational prospects of young learners are really not much taken into consideration. Okay, so now, if I can scroll properly. No, it's not working. Okay, these are your themes. I'm just telling you what's in your brochure and telling you that I've read it, basically, which you'll be reassured to know. I think there'll be other people who can talk about theory, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that in practical areas like teaching, and teaching is an eminently practical thing, theory should be serviceable. We're interested in theory that works for improvement. Pedagogy, the same thing, obviously. Networks and networking, inevitably, if you're an EAL teacher, you are involved in networks. These are the networks of the lives of the learners in particular, but also professional networks. And here, where I'm going to spend most of my focus today. Okay, we know these are the themes. Now, I thought I'd do something that I've not normally done. This is a bonding exercise. My first teaching job that I think I can remember, a lot of my life is hazy for reasons that are not interesting to go into now, but my first teaching job that I can remember really is what I would call something like an EAL teacher. Oh no, we've gone one too many. What's going on here? Can someone help me with this, please? It's not... I want to go back one slide. The mouse doesn't... the mouse has been eaten by a cat, and I'll use that. Yeah, I'll use that. That's my level of technology. But it's still not working. It's stuck. I want to go back one.
Yeah, the whole USB versus laptop. Alright, just use his pen and use left and right arrow.
Okay, all right, that's good. A pen. We'll go back to the pen, you see. The mighty pen, it will never be beaten. So we have to go back one. In 1975, okay, excuse the few minutes, I'm going to beg time from the coffee for this. I was much younger than I am now, and some of you probably weren't even born, but there was civil and political unrest in Timor, and this affected my life in a very direct way. You can just read the top paragraph, but it's a very important part of what impelled me onto some of the career choices that I made. Not far from here, there was something that was called a migrant reception centre, but actually it was an accommodation centre. And through you know, these have been created basically to physically settle people. They were a bit like residential places. They were very basic. I can't remember what they're called anymore, those semicircular Nissan-type hut-type things. And they were incredibly cold in winter. They had cement floors, poor kitchens, and they were really overcrowded. They were meant to be temporary accommodation for people, and some of them had actually functioned as detention centres in the literal sense as we know them now. Through a convoluted set of processes, mainly through an Italian welfare agency, I was hired by a social worker friend to be a tutor in one of these centres. And it turned out that the majority of people there that I was tutoring were Timorese. They'd come in through the consequence of this crisis in Dili. And one of my first jobs, when I turned up expecting to have a meeting with someone and ask them, what is my job? And they said, oh, over there. And I said, what do you mean over there? Shouldn't someone tell me what I'm doing? And they said, no, there's a class, you have to go. And so I didn't even know that I was actually supposed to teach them. I can tell you that things are really a lot better these days. And I was supposed to teach this thing called English to a group of women who'd fled the invasion. They were just women, and quite a few young children in the class. And the manager told me that my job was, when I said, I don't know how to teach English, I've never taught English. I could have said, I barely know it myself. But he said, you just have to help them communicate. It's easy, like what's involved in teaching people English. And on another occasion, he said to me, this is the next day when I said, surely yesterday was a joke and today you'll give me a proper job. And he said, no, you just have to help them understand, which you can already, I was really struggling about this on the plane, and I thought, I hadn't realised the significance of this. His climb down from help them communicate to help them understand the next day, to make me feel better, as though I was the important person in the whole process, when really there were all these people there. And they had babies and children, and some of them spoke Portuguese and were literate, but the majority of them were not literate. I speak Italian, I was very close to Portuguese, it was reasonably close. I actually managed some kind of communication with them in what I call Neo-Latin gibberish here. Some of them spoke Tetun and others spoke other things, but many of them were highly traumatised. And I was this young kid who was supposed to help them understand. Well, what did they have to understand? Anyway, it didn't take long to realise that I actually wouldn't be doing much of this thing called teaching English, or that it really wasn't a good label for what I, an untrained teacher, would be actually doing with them. So I think we did a lot of wonderful things that actually helped change my life in many ways. What we did was lots of filling in of forms. I came to know things about people's lives that weren't my business. I went to doctors with people. We did all sorts of things. And one of the things that I learned was just how bizarre form filling in is. One of the things that was often asked of these women, and I remember it as the most clear thing, which I had to ask my mother to interpret for me. One of the things said, how many children do you have? And when we finally got the message through, it was clear that this was not a simple question. It didn't mean for them, how many children have you given birth to? It meant, how many children are you responsible for? And they were responsible for lots of children that they had actually picked up at Dili Harbour. There were lots and lots of people killed, and so people just grabbed anyone, ran to the boat, and they particularly picked up little children. If you go to Timor today, you'll see it's a society with lots and lots and lots of people who are a lot shorter than me. So it's a place with a lot of children, as it always was. So this was a beginning of an opening to what was involved in EAL, which was interpreting society and its assumptions in offices and explaining things that I, even though I'd grown up as a non-English speaker and actually done interpreting it for my parents in hospitals and other places, I had kind of not remembered that anymore. I had a university degree, which is the way you forget lots of things. So we would do things like negotiating things for hire. There weren't as many things in shops in those days, and so we used to negotiate things and get kids into school and, go to the post office where you used to go. These days, post offices are basically mini supermarkets. In those days, they were post offices, to contact people in Portugal or Timor. And, I was doing crazy things like pretending to interpret for them. Now, I don't think that that's a kind of ideal EAL practice, but it made me think this. Was I actually teaching English? The books I was handed to teach were books that had been prepared, and this is how English teaching was at the time. A lot of adult English teachers were, in fact, infants' years teachers. The idea was adults who didn't speak English were infants. And so this whole process of infantilization happened through the entire system. Teachers of immigrants were paid less than teachers of, normal people, in inverted commas, and they were taught in a way that assumed that not knowing English was almost a kind of stupidity. Actually, I think really at some level in our society we still have a view a little bit like that. But it was very interesting because English was seen to be, and fortunately this has been transformed completely, of course, an abstract system of rules and all of these kinds of things here. But there was no reference to what it actually was for them. This is where both pedagogy and theory of English and what language, not just English, but what language actually is as social activity and social practice, language as the practice of making the world work for you. There was no reference to where it did work for them in housing commission flats, a post office, or incredible trauma that people suffered, and which meant a huge amount about their inability to do what was being done, what was being required. Okay, this makes me think of the role of teachers, and I think of the role of teachers as language planners, and I'm stuck on this idea of language planning. It's what I do. Very few people really think much about the concept, but language planning involves the preparation of the future communication environment in which we are all going to live. And teachers, I think, should be absolutely in the forefront of discussions about this by seeing themselves as more than just teachers of language, but planners of language or communication in general. But I think you have this role, or we have this role, in two distinct ways. Firstly, as citizens, where I think we should be much more active, using the specialist experience and knowledge, the unique perspective on the world of immigration and settlement and refugee population. We are on the cusp of the biggest transformation the world has seen for a really long time. And the world in 10 years' time is going to be incomprehensible to us all. We must get to know this better. And the people who know it relatively well but need to theorize it a lot more, I think, are language teachers. Because language education, like settlement and moving across borders, is one of the things that's being completely detached from the nation state from which these things have grown up historically. And I think that there should be a voice for teachers, and that you have to insist on this in these debates. Now, I put them in inverted commas because we don't have debates in Australian politics. We call them debates because we're being polite, but we have something else called shouting matches or something. It doesn't happen very often. Do EAL teachers get quoted in debates about settlement? I haven't seen any, not for a long time. The success in education for migrant children, Indigenous children, the well-being of communities, refugee policy, citizenship and social cohesion. These are all topics that are regularly in the media, on the ABC and in the commercial media, in which I think you can claim a distinctive voice, but it's not there. And all these above strike me as areas where we should demand recognition. I don't think that we can prevail in these debates, but I think we should be at least acknowledged as having a perspective. And beyond that role, which is the citizen role of teachers, I think there's a professional teacher role of teachers as language planning, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the most part in this talk today. So we have the debates, and then we have this role as language planners. We're not teaching English, or we're not just teaching English as an additional language. But even if we did teach English as an additional language, what does that actually mean that we are doing? We are teaching an additional language. It means we're crafting onto an existing communication world another form of communication. That new form of communication must take its place in response to the existing communication world of the people whom we are teaching. The Tetum and Portuguese women that I was supposedly teaching in 1975-76 were already, many of them, vastly more experienced about life than certainly I was then and probably am now, and had communication systems and had a particular view about language and communication, all of which my teaching was exotic to, unrelated to, had no connection with. So teachers do this mostly when we just get a curriculum that someone gives us and we teach it. That's an implementation exercise. But we do much, much more, and I'm going to go through this quoting myself in a few minutes. We model language forms. This seems like a very obvious thing, but I'll say something about that in a minute. Because you can't model a language form without making a statement about existing or other alternative language forms. And we must talk to students about our process of doing that the ones we model are just ones that happen to have a certain amount of traction in the world in which they live, but that there are many others. I'll give you a tiny example about this. Many years ago, I visited a French teaching program, and this was just at the beginning, it wasn't that long ago really, when the national curriculum was coming out. And the national curriculum said that we had to have a cross-curriculum perspective for Aboriginality, Aboriginal studies, and studies of Asia and sustainability. That was how it was envisaged. And this French teacher said, well, that's got nothing to do with me. I teach French. And this is true, of course, she did teach French. But actually, a really large, I did some observations of the classes, and then we had these reflections afterwards. And I remember thinking, how can I say to this person something? I don't want to criticize her because she was just doing a good job at her job, but I wanted to open up a view about the attitudes that were being projected in the teaching, because foreign language teaching, especially in schools, teaches admiration. She was teaching the kids to like France, to admire French culture. And fine, you're supposed to do that, even though lots of learners actually don't. On their first trip overseas, they don't like the food, they don't like this, they don't like something or other, and they're not prepared for it. This is what happens when classrooms are artificially removed from the kind of communicative reality that people go into. But the interesting thing was, she said, well, I am teaching attitudes. I know I'm doing that. When people say bad things about France or French because they don't like this sound, I say to them, so I correct them. So I realize I'm not just teaching language there, I'm teaching them attitudes. And I said, yes, you're teaching actually ideology in that place. But when you're teaching that, isn't it possible occasionally to say, well, the French people say this, like lots of people say things in different ways. Aboriginal people say things in different ways. These very tiny little references. And we worked up over time a little set of methods to include in French teaching and other language teaching that actually is inclusive of languages other than the one you are teaching. So you see, when we model forms, and this I know is not quite the same for EAL teachers, but I'm going to make a connection in a minute. We model forms, we're also modelling a judgment about the ones that are not being talked about, if you see what I mean. If we just say that the one you have is good and the one you're learning is positive, we might be implying other things about others, or we could explicitly not imply that if we chose to. Very importantly, we extend children's home languages to educated registers. Teachers do this with mother tongue speakers. Teach new languages, and we teach literacy. These are the most obvious forms of language planning. So I just want to put up this slide about change in education, because if anyone embarks on the idea of wanting to change anything, we all think about how difficult change is. We think about schools where EAL is not taken seriously, where teachers who are specialist trained in EAL aren't given the acknowledgement that they actually deserve, all of these kinds of things. But actually, we should, and I know most of you probably have very deeply, thought very carefully about how change in education happens. We need a theory of change before we can become active. And I've just put together a few things from Michael Fullan and from a really long time ago. Not because I particularly think he's the greatest theorist of change, but he is very good, and he focuses our attention on the subtle process of cultural change. And I like some of the quotes here that I've put in. Effective change agents neither embrace nor ignore mandates, that is what's coming from on high in curriculum or whatever. They use them as catalysts to re-examine what they are doing. This reminds me of something. The most powerful way that teachers can change practice is to evaluate what's going on. If someone asks you to evaluate, or if there's a problem in a school setting that you're part of, invite the principal to have it evaluated and include you in it. Once evaluation commences, you have been admitted to the process of thinking about the change. Remember I said before, change or any kind of power change involves a combination of knowledge and power. People in powerful positions rarely know as much as people doing the job. I mean, in our democratic system, we have people who yesterday were, and I've got nothing against used car salesmen, but this is the joke, right? Now running an education system. They can't be expected to know things. So what do? They rely on their bureaucrats. That's how our system operates. Our system operates on non-expert representatives. Our system is a non-expert representative. If it were an expert representative system, it would be a technocracy, but we are a democracy. So people are elected on the basis of the fact that they will represent people, but they're not necessarily experts. So they have to rely on experts. This means that people who are experts actually have more power than they think they have. Do you see what I mean? So language teachers are experts about language teaching. Where is the power that should come from this expertise? It's something that we have to grab. And the way we do that is by knowing the language of change. And the language of change involves persuading people at the top to evaluate programs, including our own, and to do them in a way that involves us. As soon as that happens, there's a process of involvement which the expert voice of the teacher enters into that space, and you can shape it. So evaluation of practice is a very powerful way for entering change. And actually, Fullan doesn't say that. You can credit me with that, but that's what he's implying, and that's what I like that. So he says problems are endemic in any change effort, both within the effort itself and via unplanned intrusions. I don't know why I put that up there, because it's pretty obvious, right? There are always problems. But he says problems are our friends in another way of saying that conflict is essential to any successful change effort. That's why you need an association. Individual teachers are constantly picked off in schools and classrooms and across systems. It's only collectively that we can have power. So it's important to act both within classrooms, at schools, and in networks where it's possible to introduce EAL knowledge and say this should prevail. This is a kind of leadership at the local level, but the association, activist associations, provide the backup that makes it possible to cope with the conflict that can sometimes arise from taking those positions. So these other ones I think are also obvious, but they're very important things to think about. And the very last one I think is the one that I most want to stress. Individual moral purposes, that is, we're concerned about this group of learners, the Timorese women I was teaching, you might be teaching Afghan children or adults, or, I don't know, whatever kind of environment you're in. These things are important, but they're always instances of something bigger. They're always the instantiation of the wider framework that's going on. So to contribute to the issue of the day, you have to make the link between the children you are teaching, the adults you are teaching, the problem that's going on in that reception centre, and the wider political, social environment, and indeed even global questions. But let's not get too ambitious, right? But at least linking to national debates, because these things are not separate from those things. They are the local, grounded instance of the bigger question. Okay. So Now, before I start my 8 points of teachers as language planners, I want to just say, hey, some of you are probably going to think this is really wacky, but I came across this quote some years ago when I was trying to argue that teacher power and the discoursal power, I'll call it, of teachers is grossly underplayed by ourselves, by academics, by teachers, and by teacher associations. It's partly because in the last 15 years with neoliberal restructuring of education, there's so much atomised thing, people are working in isolation, there's a lot of things that make collective action harder than it used to be, right? But we have to overcome that. I heard a paper in Sydney a few months ago of someone who was tracing the history of adult literacy education and the conflicts between adult literacy and adult ESL. And I remember because, I lived through a lot of this, and it struck me as an amazing silencing. We were much, much more powerful once. I don't know how many of you remember that, but it really was the case that teacher voices were much more powerful than they are today. So I came across this quote. This is from Talleyrand, Baron Talleyrand, who at the French Convention, this is the end of the 18th century, right, in Paris, just before they start separating a lot of people from their heads. And they want to create, now, I don't recommend you follow this advice, okay? I'm just putting it there to show you by counterexample that people have always thought and understood the power, and in this case, of elementary teachers or primary school teachers, right? The power of teacher talk. It wasn't invented in American applied linguistics in the 1960s. Nothing was, actually. But this was actually a precept of political power that goes back a long way. And no one said it more terribly and shockingly as Talleyrand, because what he said was that it was terrible. France is becoming a big colonial power, and elites in Africa were learning standard correct French, but people all through France were speaking non-standard forms of speech. And to be equal under the precepts of the French Revolution, you had to be the same. It wasn't a time of multiculturalism, right? The French Revolution was very anti this kind of thing. So colonial expansion, while in regional areas and among the urban poor, all these non-standard, what they called rubbish talk. And so Talleyrand said the way to fix this is that every village will have a school. This is one of the origins of compulsory elementary school. Every village will have a school, and the job of the teacher will be to put an end to this strange inequality. In other words, to have people abroad who speak correct French and people locally who speak rubbish. In school, all will be taught in the language of the Constitution. I could give an essay about that. And the law. And this massive corrupt dialects, that is, these languages that people identified with, he called them this massive corrupt dialects, these last vestiges of feudalism will be forced to disappear. So he saw primary school teachers as doing the job of the revolution, of completing the job. Teaching, the most basic acts of teaching, that is, inculcating learners into forms of speech, are part of the deepest process of social transformation that history has produced. It's really important not to atomize our work, to see it as separate from wider change. How people talk and how they are able to talk is a large part of how they are present in the world, whether they're able to defend themselves with people on the street or in a court of law, with in-laws, with anybody. I mean, verbal ability is a really important part of personal power. So let's never underestimate that. Our verbal ability is an incredibly important part of the personal power of individuals. And then you aggregate that into collective power of whole groups. Whether or not they're present and respected in society depends on their ability to participate in conversations, in arguments, in letter writing. Our language is the structure that positions us in many ways, in which we position ourselves in. So a huge amount of power comes from this. So I think, therefore, now, what's going on here? Oh, yeah. I've come up with 8 ways that I think, building on educational linguistics and Spolsky's original work. I'm just going to describe these, and they won't all be about EAL, but many of them are. 8 ways in which classroom language planning and teachers as classroom language planning do what Pat Talleyrand said and much more. Classroom language planning, classroom language in general, implements norm choices, I'll explain that in a minute, of code register made available from those available to the participants in that setting, the learner and the teacher. In other words, the learner and the teacher are a communication universe together. What's available for the learner and the teacher when the door closes and there's just the interaction between the teacher and the learner? A whole lot of norms. The teacher is like a ruler of a verbal kingdom and can say, these kinds of ways of speaking are not acceptable and these other ones are. That's norm choicing, making choices about what will be normalized there. So there, the classroom is a mini country. It's a mini France in revolutionary times. It's a mini environment in which the teacher dictates the norms that children are led to believe, some of you probably teaching adults, are acceptable. Obviously, that's slightly different. So teachers regulate and control permitted language, topics and arguments, what can be said, and they police how things can be said. So this is the teacher as a language planner. You're not just, what if the child says things in, I don't know what language they might have, Vietnamese or another language? What is the teacher's judgment or attitude about that? What's permitted to be said, and how is it policed by the teacher through attitudes, through disapproval, through welcoming, through encouragement, through research? How many teachers actually ask their students to describe a map of their language worlds? Who do I speak? What language do I speak to my parents in, to my uncles in? Do I talk on the phone or online in Tigrinya to anyone? And then to talk about the language worlds of the children in the classroom, so that when we are teaching EAL, everyone knows that we're teaching EAL to people that we know and are known to other people to have other languages. These kinds of pluralizing moments might seem very small, but I think in the lives of little children, they're actually very important. And teacher language choices themselves confirm, modify or subvert what is required by the curriculum. This is really clear. When the doors close, it doesn't matter what, don't quote me, okay, at the University of Melbourne saying this, it doesn't matter what the national curriculum says. What really matters is what the teacher does. This is a space of teacher sovereignty, and it's extremely, and the link to national discourse, that sovereignty is very useful there. Teachers are in charge here, and they're in charge of a world that's all about communication. And what we actually do, now imagine I'm in with these Timorese women in 1975-76, and I'm told to help them understand, help them understand. That was my remit. But actually, as we discovered, or they taught me to understand, what I was doing with them was actually a lot more useful than what the system thought I could do with them. And it was by basically failing to do what the system told me to do that we did much more interesting things. So I think this is really important, that teachers make choices in classrooms about language, about attitudes to language as well. The second of the 8 is the teacher classroom language. What time should I stop? Teacher classroom, I'm going to be quicker now, reflects subject or disciplinary codes, specialised terminologies, discourses and vocabs. These structure and organise the content which is conveyed in classrooms. This is probably, this is focused around how teachers of EAL in this particular case influence children's understanding of what works as language in general in content areas. I can't explain that because that's just going to take too long. Teacher classroom language contains moments of meta-linguistic reflection, observation and analysis. This is really important. There have been some really interesting studies of what kids actually, extra language things that kids learn in classrooms, and it's very interesting when you trace what those things are. They come from asides the teachers make. Things like, that's what they might say, or this is not very important. It's these kinds of things. It's a set of labeling, or it's a kind of little universe surrounding the actual communication in class. That's these moments of what I call metalinguistic reflection, when a teacher might say, oh, that's a very difficult rule, or something like that. It was like the French teacher before, where she was aware that she was actually helping the kids to admire what they were studying. And this is ideological, and this is what teachers do a lot as well. We need to be aware of that and negotiate those things with learners. More importantly, and more directly, the literacy and literate practices of the teacher, what the teacher promotes and validates as acceptable literacy practice. How much do we ask children of what reading is done in the class? I know, at home rather, and what their parents do, what kind of literate environment do they live in, what online environment do they live in. I know probably many of you do a lot of this, but it's very important to involve teachers implementing written language norms and standards in a similar way to those teachers implement for spoken language. In other words, what we do in terms of judgments about spoken language, we do for judgments of written language. So this is another way in which children's general attitudes to reading and the place of written language in the world is structured by the conversation of teachers, not by what they teach. I'm talking about by the overlay here, obviously by what they teach as well. Classroom teacher language interacts with students' communication. We know this, it's obvious. There's a dialogic relation with student talk. Teachers cannot simply impose their norms and expectations of how communication should be conducted. We know that, but we also know that actually most classroom patterning of communication like this sets a model for what children expect monolingual, as they perceive most EAL teachers to be. Most bilingual EAL learners perceive their teachers to be monolingual. This is something that can easily be corrected. If you know other languages, tell your kids that you do and make sure that they know that that's the case. A dialogic relation with student talk to normalise pluralism. This is really important. And teacher talk contains persuasion and rhetoric, as well as making and limiting choices in what students are encouraged to say and write. Now, persuasion and rhetoric is very subtle. The way teachers usually get involved in persuasion and rhetoric is by nuance and tone. Very often teachers will say some things that are expected and are much more inviting, usually through intonation, and discouraged through tone too. Learners learn very quickly, there's more of them, and they know that they don't control the talk in the class. What it is that persuasion and rhetoric is taken to be. Student talk and writing is responded to, promoting and discouraging in subtle and overt ways forms of politeness. That is, are children encouraged to speak even if they are impolite? Permitted topics for discussion or personal disclosure. Personal disclosure is a really important question. I mean, I lived and worked in Sri Lanka for some years, and one of the biggest problems that local kids, especially girls, had in English classes were that they were supposed to say a lot of things about themselves that they just didn't want to say. They didn't want to say things about their parents to a stranger. They didn't want to say things about relatives of their home life. They just felt that this was none of the teacher's business. So it's this kind of question: what is the personal disclosure limit of children? What things do they think are okay for a teacher to ask me about? And how questions are asked of others, etc. Look, I'm rushing because I've taken too long so far. In this way, teachers, all this is verbal socialisation of learners into conversational competence. It's not just language, it's conversational competence. Language is a bunch of things that fit into a practice, a social practice that we can call conversational competence. And it involves a whole lot of behaviours, including how to conduct a conversation. When is it okay to interrupt someone? When is it okay to say, I've been listening to you now, it's my time to talk, and stuff like that. These are things that we should teach explicitly because they're very different in families and in other cultures from what they are like in English and in standard English in formal environments especially. And finally, teachers convey language, attitudes and ideology influencing students' opinions and views, sometimes failing to do that. And we do this, as I said, not overtly, although sometimes teachers do it overtly. Okay, so I just want to put this one up again and say to you as a reminder, I think teachers and teacher associations should show leadership through using their association or their connection at where the rubber hits the road of migration and the change in the demographic composition of the world by participating in debates openly. But teachers themselves in their private practice or their school practice are doing the same kind of thing. They're structuring the language worlds of learners in a very deep world. They're language planners. So I think, what are some of the critical questions for thinking beyond the classroom? If we really want to do this, what exactly are the educational needs of EAL learners? Is this really something that we have documented? Are the educational needs of EAL learners actually understood? I don't believe that they are, because we haven't studied what the language demands of other areas of the curriculum really are on these children. So if we push them into a geography class, what are the language demands of that geography class that we're preparing for them? We have to demand much more research be done in this. There is practically no EAL research money involved in Australia anymore. We used to have a lot of research. Now, some people who are expert at this stuff, I can see Howard Nicholas here and the latest speaker here, who can answer a lot of these questions. But I don't believe that we do have enough systematic Australian research knowledge of exactly this. So a lot of EAL teaching about beyond the EAL classroom to other classrooms is about your observation of what's needed, your own experience of teaching. All of that's valuable, but we need research on it as well. Do we have a theory of change that's credible? I don't know that we do. In fact, I don't think we do. I don't think teacher associations in general do. But I think we do. We need to understand the power of language to change the individual lives of people and collectively. That's not something I think that we have done, and I think teacher associations need to take a role in that. What forms of power and influence can EAL teachers and teacher associations have? I think we can think about that in terms of lots of things. You know, why are we not trying to influence media understandings of what's represented? Why are we not trying to actually get involved in discussions on Q&A or other programs? I think it's really important that there are never any tweets. I hate the tweets that go along on Q&A anyway, but so don't send them. I'll be annoyed. But it might be a good thing to do. I don't know. I might be wrong about that. But it's certainly something. I just don't see an active voice that we have, and we all should make an effort to make that change. Are we positioned in such a way that we can act and think in and beyond the classroom for social improvement? But if we did say that, what do we mean by social improvement? Do we have a vision that says that we want EAL learners to be full bilingual participants in our community? I think TESOL should say that. I think TESOL associations should be really, and you probably are, and forgive me if I'm implying that you're not, but I think it's really important that we be upfront about that kind of thing. And within the classroom, we can reflect on the ways in which teachers are language planners. So that's it. I think I've finished on time. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that's of some use.